Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Charles Miller, and I'm here interviewing Danny Vargas. Today's date is July 19th, 2023, and we are interviewing via Zoom. The first question I'm going to ask you is your date and place of birth.
I was born in New York City, December 21st, 1965.
All right, and what were the names of your parents, their occupations, and did they serve in the military at all?
So my parents did not serve in the military. My mom was Carmen Vargas, who passed away in 2016. My father was Raul Vargas, who lives in New York City right now. He works as a retired super for an apartment building in New York City.
And what schooling did you have before entering the military?
I went through the New York City public school system and joined the Air Force right out of high school.
And did you hold any jobs while you were in high school?
I held lots of jobs. I guess my first job was I was 12 years old, and I did like a snow cone type cart in the streets. But back in those days, it was a big block of ice, and it was like a metal scraper, and I would sell snow cones on the streets of Brooklyn back in those days. And beyond that, I had other jobs. I had summer jobs with a youth employment program in New York City. I worked in a pharmacy. I worked delivering display cases in Manhattan. So all kinds of various and sundry jobs.
And what were your motivations to join the service?
So when I was a kid, I was part of a cadet organization, which was a program that was designed to keep kids off the streets. It was a Navy cadet type program. I grew up in pretty austere conditions in a pretty bad neighborhood called Bushwick in Brooklyn. My parents divorced when I was 2 years old. I was the youngest of four kids, three older sisters. We ended up on the welfare system, so it was pretty rough upbringing. Using that cadet organization as a vehicle to stay out of trouble was good. It provided me not only that, but also sort of access to sort of the military routine and marching and all that type of thing. I had friends that had joined the military. One in particular joined the Air Force, which as I was looking to join the military as a way to get out of that environment, I saw Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force, and it dawned on me that the Air Force would probably be my best course of action.
And what was your family's thoughts on you joining?
Well, my mom, who never learned to read or write, she grew up in a small town in Puerto Rico, and never learned much English. Since I was joining the Air Force underage, I joined at 17. She had to put an X on a piece of paper to authorize me to join the Air Force underage. She wasn't crazy about me joining the military and and the risks associated with it. I tried to convince her that the Air Force was the least risky of the branches, and that the career field that I chose was going to be good. I couldn't tell them much about what I was going to do because I was running the intelligence career field. So for the first couple of years, they thought that I worked in admin.
Did you realize what a big deal it was to be joining at age 17? Now kind of where you sit today?
In retrospect, I think, growing up in the streets, you build up a level of street skills, right? So there's a level of toughness that's associated with that. And then having experienced the cadet organization, I was exposed to sort of the rigors of discipline and so forth. So I didn't think that it was going to be that big of a transition until I got to basic training.
And you want to talk about basic training and what that was like?
Yeah. So I enlisted at the facility was Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn. And you get on a bus and they put you on an airplane, they fly you down to San Antonio, Texas, and Lackland Air Force Base where basic training is. And you get off the bus and, you're greeted by drill instructors, training instructors who yell at you and call you all kinds of names. And the next morning you're put in a barber's chair and they clip off all your hair. And you go to bed that night with the bald head and the little stubble scraping against the pillowcase, and you start to realize, wow, this is different. This is not what I expected.
Not Brooklyn.
So it's not Brooklyn anymore. But the thing about basic training is that the theory is that they sort of break down all of the things that make you individuals and so forth, and then rebuild you up as a unit, as part of a larger organization. So it takes some of the individuality away and creates a more cohesive environment and identity. And I think that's ultimately what the benefit of basic training is. It puts you on the glide path towards having more of a unit mentality.
What were some of the things you were learning?
In basic training or in the military in general? In basic training is more literally, as the name implies, the basics, right? You learn basics of drill and marching. That's why they had me be the flight chief at the time, was already knew that part. But you learn about sort of the rules and regulations and laws associated with serving in the military. You learn about combat arms, and you learn to fire an M16 at that time. You learn about sort of the ways that organizations are able to function effectively as a unit. So all of that stuff, and discipline, and sort of the little things that you never thought would matter, like folding your underwear in little 6-inch squares, right? And those types of things that are, at the end of the day, they're sort of head games, but they are more about teaching you discipline and attention to detail, and making sure that you're doing things the right way for the right reasons, right? So all of those things are sort of little learning experiences that you end up keeping in the back of your mind as you move forward throughout your, not only your military career, but even after that.
And did you go to like a specialist school or like technical school after that?
Spent about a year in technical training before getting to my first real duty assignment. So after basic training, so my job, I was a cryptologic linguist, right? So which meant that your job is to collect and interpret information in a different language, and you're able to utilize that to develop intelligence products, right? So even though I already knew Spanish, right? So at the end of basic training, they brought all of us linguists together and gave us our language assignments. And they said, okay, Airman Vargas, you're going to be a Russian linguist. And I said, wait, stop. I already speak Spanish. Test me, trust me. So they tested me, but they still needed a place to put me until I got my security clearance. Getting a security clearance can take several months. And I can just imagine the agents going out to the streets of Bushwick, Brooklyn, and finding it challenging to get that information. But so they said to me to...
Did they go back to your neighborhood?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But so needing a place to put me, they sent me to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, for 5 months to take intermediate Spanish. So it did help, frankly, I'll be honest with you, because the Spanish that I spoke at home was kind of street Spanish, right? And you get to a point where you need to learn more proper grammar and language and terminology. So you had to learn, military terminology, diplomatic terminology, etc. All those things that you would need once you actually start doing the actual job. So the 5 months weren't a waste. They really were helpful. After that, then you go to a more technological aspect of the job, and that was in San Angelo, Texas, where you learn the actual more technical sides of the job. Everything from the equipment that you're going to be using, as well as the theories behind the electromagnetic spectrum, all that kind of thing. And then at that point is where I had to choose whether I was going to be ground-based or airborne-based. I chose to be airborne, which meant that I would do my job on an airplane, right? So that being the case, and it being the Cold War, you had to go to survival school. So survival school for me was going to the woods outside of Spokane, Washington, and doing the survival training, where they teach you how to escape an invasion, and what to do if you're in the woods, and you parachute down in the woods and you got to survive. So they teach how to build a lean-to out of parachute material. They teach how to forage for food and hunt for animals, and put you in a mock prisoner of war camp so you can know how to deal with interrogation techniques and so forth. So all of that was super interesting. Not the most comfortable thing in the world, but super interesting. And then immediately after that was water survival training, which was down in Homestead, Florida, where they would teach you that. So the first part was land-based. The next part was sea-based. So if you parachute down and you're in the water, you have to learn how to survive in the water. Right? So all of that was a little over a year of training between all those different aspects of it, until I finally got to my first duty assignment in January of 1985. So I joined in November of 83, basic training. I didn't get to my first duty assignment until January of 85, which was in the Republic of Panama. We had several bases in Panama at the time. We no longer do because of the treaty between the United States and Panama. Come the year 2000, we closed all those bases and removed all of those facilities and personnel and equipment and so forth. So I got to Panama in January of 85 for what was ostensibly supposed to be a 2-year assignment, and I kept extending. I stayed there for almost 5 years because the mission was fascinating. So I spent most of my life on C-130. Our missions were on C-130s, typically about 12 hours long or so. But 12 hours is sort of a misinterpretation of it, because there was pre-briefings that had to take place, and then after the mission, there was processing that had to be done. So it was very, very long days.
Yeah, what type of intelligence were you collecting in Panama? Well, what was your mission about?
So I can't tell you, but I can tell you that at the time, if you go back in the history books, you see there was a lot going on in Central America. There was the Contras and the Sandinistas. In Nicaragua, there was the strife, the civil war going on in El Salvador. There was issues happening in Honduras. In Panama, eventually the Noriega situation started to flare up. So there was a lot going on in that particular geography at that particular time.
And would you say the team that you were operating with, was it just a small group that was kind of embedded in Panama, or was it a large operation? Can you give us a sense for the scale, and were there people in some of the other countries as well that you would coordinate with, Guatemala or other places?
Sure. So at the time, the headquarters for the United States Southern Command was in Panama. Today it's in Florida. So it was a fairly large, substantial military presence in Panama. Not just the Air Force, but Army, Marine Corps, Navy, etc. So you had lots of bases there. Our particular squadron, the 16930 Electronic Security Squadron, which doesn't exist anymore because they changed the names of the major commands and so forth. But I would say that we had maybe 200 people in that squadron or so, many of which were airborne operators, some of which were more ground-based. So there were a variety of activities that took place. There was the airborne operators that would do collecting. You'd have analysts. Even on the missions, you had different positions, right? So you had operators, you had analysts, you had airborne mission supervisors. I started as an operator, became an analyst, and eventually became an airborne mission supervisor. I think probably one of the youngest people ever to be able to become an airborne mission supervisor in that career field. Where as a staff sergeant, I was telling officers that were the pilots, basically the bus drivers, where to go and what to do and what to evade in terms of dangers that were coming at us. We didn't have permanent party front end crews. We had folks coming in from Air National Guards from different states around the country coming down to Panama to fly our missions for us. So that made it very interesting. So we'd have to get to know brand new front end crews coming in from, let's say, the Pennsylvania Air National Guard, just to explain to them what we could about our mission, because many of them were not cleared for it. And then, as an airborne mission supervisor, would tell them, sir, I need you to go here, here, and here. And in mid-flight, we'd have to make adjustments along the way. At the time, I would have to report directly to the White House or the Pentagon on activities that might be taking place. So there was a lot of responsibility for, I guess at the time I was maybe 21 years old, maybe 22. Um, and it was not just the information that was a big responsibility, but the lives of the people on board, and the millions of dollars worth of equipment on board. So I had to do everything I could to keep everyone safe, and still get the mission accomplished.
What was it like working with like so many different people? Like, what was the difference in work dynamics between like the Marines and like maybe foreign governments, stuff like that?
So super interesting. Again, I had the benefit of speaking Spanish, and I had the benefit of, having learned what I could from the training. So we had the opportunity to interface with local government officials in other countries, and then, the other branches that we would interact with from time to time. It was less purple than it is today. I think more of the activities today are, and when I say purple, I mean, so in between branches working together in a cohesive way. So we had less of that interaction than you see today, but it was still really super interesting. And then having the headquarters of the United States Southern Command right there in Panama also made it really interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting also was not only that piece of the job, but also living in the city, on the local economy. So I at first lived on base, but then we had the opportunity to move off base into just the local economy, and living in apartments in Panama City. We had a couple of different apartments in Panama City, had a wonderful time. It's a wonderful country with wonderful people. The food is great. The environment was wonderful. So it was a great time until the whole thing with General Noriega took place, when, because of the political strife that was going on, the government of Panama suspended civil rights. In other words, they instituted martial law for a while. So I remember sitting in my apartment in Panama City, listening to the radio and hearing the voice on the radio in Spanish saying, the people of Panama, we would get to inform you that all rights have been suspended.
That's incredible.
And what was it like? What did that look like?
So looking out the window, I could see the trucks that would disperse sort of the protests. And there were these big trucks with water cannons on top, for example, and they would spray the protesters with water cannons. We used to be able to drive onto the base for our missions in our flight suits, but we couldn't do that anymore. We'd have to go in civilian clothes to drive onto the base, because you didn't want to get caught by, the local police in uniform, and they would know that you were military in case they wanted to harass, the American troops. And again, the benefit of speaking Spanish was helpful at the time, but it was kind of dicey at the time, knowing that you're living in an environment where, you have no civil rights at that time.
And did you have to move back onto the base? Was it
eventually? Yeah, eventually they did bring us all back onto the base. Yeah, which was, again, challenging. Once you become accustomed to living on your own and so forth, and not being in sort of the barracks dorm type environment, it's hard to move back in.
Sorry, I'm still a little confused. I'm like, what does like having no civil rights look like? Because like, obviously living in the United States, you've always had civil rights. So I've never done anything else. Like, what did that look like for an average civilian?
It means that you can be stopped at any time for any reason, for any cause, and that you would think that you would have the right to call an attorney, you would have the right to to call and so forth. All that was suspended, so the military, the police in Panama could stop and arrest you for any reason or no reason.
Wow. So like, you have a red shirt, like, I'm not happy today, I'm gonna arrest you. Wow.
So we had to keep a very low profile at the time, and this was right before, I ended up leaving Panama about 3 weeks before the invasion of Panama, Operation Just Cause. You may have heard of it. So it was, I left, I want to say either the end of November, beginning of December of '89. and the actual invasion of Just Cause took place, I want to say the third week of December, to remove Noriega, basically, as the dictator. And I was sitting I was sitting in New York in my sister's apartment when I was watching it on the news because I was on leave. And all I could do was let me get on the phone so they can send me back, because I just wanted to go back, because that was the mission that I had been participating in and training for, and so forth. So, and I was being reassigned to San Antonio, it was the headquarters of our major command. So in that span of time between leaving Panama and getting to San Antonio, I took some leave time in New York with my family, and hadn't taken much leave time at all during the almost 5 years I was in Panama. It was challenging in terms of staying in touch with the family at the time, because to make it, especially for the first couple of years, to call home, you had to find a way to get downtown Panama City. You had to go to one of the national telephone, because the telephone company was government owned and run, and had to go to an office. You'd have to pay in advance. You'd have to give them the number you want to get in touch with. They make the connection, and they tell you what booth to go to. You pick up the phone, and you're able to talk to your family members, and then they'll interrupt and say, okay, you have 2 minutes left. And then you hang up. So I was able to call home maybe 3 or 4 times in the first couple of years that I was there. It's not like pulling out your phone out of your pocket and making a phone call.
Yeah, it sounds like a prison
ordeal.
Yeah. Your poor mom.
What was it like working on a ship 12 hours a day, just being in the plane? Did you ever get breaks? And if so, what would you do on a plane?
Not a whole lot of breaks, no. If you had to use the restroom, you had to stand up and go to the back of the airplane. A C-130 is not the most comfortable ride in the world. If you've ever seen a picture of it, it's a large cargo plane with 4 propellers, and it's noisy, and it's uncomfortable. We actually did our job inside these big steel metal huts that were inside there. You sat on a seat with a parachute behind you, and you just strap in. So it was not the most comfortable thing in the world, but you'd get up every once in a while and stretch your legs if you needed to, but you'd always have to have somebody covering for you.
And feel free not to answer this, but it wasn't much different than working in the normal office, because is it just an office in the sky, or were you actually out collecting information, flying over places and taking surveillance?
Yeah, it was absolutely not like the office. No, you knew that you were, 25,000 feet in the air on a very noisy, uncomfortable airframe, and your job was intense sometimes. There was a lot going on in Central America at the time, so there was not a whole lot of dull moments. And you also had, you had Cubans that had been going to Nicaragua, and Cubans were not our friends at the time. So there was a lot of strife happening in the region, and which made the mission not only that much more important, but also that much more interesting. So,
did you feel in danger most of the time, some of the time, or how would you kind of put that on the scale?
So there's 2 things, right? There's the inherent danger of being on an airplane. We were hit by lightning a few times. There were times where we would lose an engine or 2, right? Fortunately, a C-130 is an incredibly robust airframe. That's a plane that fly in the eye of hurricanes, right? So there were times where there's a long HF whip antenna that goes from the tail to the front of the plane. Sometimes that would break and it would smack against the fuselage. And so being struck by lightning was probably the most hairy part of it. Every once in a while, we would do exercises, or we would do combat assault landings, which means that you're 1,000 feet above the runway, and you sort of corkscrew down in, and you sort of land with a thud. So there's the inherent nature of just flying. And then secondly, the fact that they were unfriendlies on the ground, keeping an eye on us and tracking us. And we knew that there were surface to air missiles down there. So not that they would necessarily reach us, but there was the potential for that at any given point. So yeah, there was risk associated with the mission itself.
Do you want to talk about like the transition from Panama to San Antonio?
Yeah. So there's a difference between being in the field and being in headquarters, and that's the case in the military. It's the case in corporate America as well. Uh, so if you've got a large corporation that you're working for, and if you're in one of the field offices, there's a lot of camaraderie and so forth. The headquarters element feels more distant, right? Serving overseas, you've got a lot more camaraderie. You've got a more family feel to it, if you will, in terms of the people like you're working with and so forth. The one thing I never understood were the people who would get assigned to an overseas assignment, and they would get on base housing, and they would never leave the base. It's like, what's the point of being assigned overseas? You take advantage of the opportunity from time to time to sort of learn about the environment and get to know the country a little bit, and grow as a human being by just experiencing that. Coming to a headquarters element, when I came to San Antonio, I was a program manager for systems, and that was very administrative. Every once in a while, I'd be able to go on TDYs or deployments to be able to keep my airborne rating. So that kept it really interesting, but it became more of a administrative job than I had been used to. At that point is where I decided, I've I was 23 years old, 24 years old at the time. And I had been an airborne operator, had been an analyst, had been an airborne mission supervisor, the types of things that would take people 15, 20 years in their career to be able to achieve. And I did it in 6. So I had enlisted for 6 years, and I extended for a year. So the time I spent in San Antonio was where I realized that I was either going to have to cross train into a different career field to keep things interesting, or get out and begin my career in this civilian world.
And what rank were you when you left the service?
I was a staff sergeant, E5.
And then you want to talk about like kind of transitioning back to civilian life, and how was that?
Sure. So fortunately, I made that decision to get out about maybe 6 months before I ended up getting out. So, and I was stateside, so it made it easier for me to, beef up my resume and get it sent out to companies and corporations in the United States. Had I been overseas, it would have been more difficult. This was before email. This was before, text messages, before cell phones and so forth. So you had to do things analog, right? And sending your resume via mail, of all things, to companies. So fortunately, I was able to line up a job with a company based in State College, Pennsylvania, that was doing government contracting. And there was a contract that was, again, serving the intelligence community, doing similar things to what I had been doing. So I took that job, and I had gotten married, by the way, in the interim. I met my wife while I was home on leave in New York, when the whole Noriega thing was happening. And we ended up getting married shortly thereafter. So we loaded up the car and we drove from San Antonio, Texas to State College, Pennsylvania, which was a 3-day trek. Leaving Texas took a day. It's a big state. And we get to State College and started doing my job, which involved a lot of overseas travel as well. And then traveling to Northern Virginia, which is where my customer was, the government agency that we had a contract with. So after about 7 months or so, the company said to me, just move to Northern Virginia. It makes it easier for travel, it makes it easier to interact with the customer and so forth. So in, what was it, May or so of 1991, we chose to move to Northern Virginia from Pennsylvania. We figured we'd try it out for a year, and we're still here 32 years later.
Thanks.
And what government agency is this?
A government agency that's involved in the intelligence community.
And then I believe you're still involved in veteran affairs, correct?
I am. So I did that job with that corporation. It became part of Raytheon Corporation. There were a couple of different mergers that took place. The company in Pennsylvania was HRV Systems. So they got bought by E Systems. They got bought by Raytheon. So by the time I did my 5 years there, it was Raytheon. And at that 5 year period, it was more the counter narcotics mission. So I was going around the jungles of South America chasing drug traffickers, basically. So my wife and I have decided to put off having kids because we wouldn't want to leave her with kids and me not coming back, right? So we had put off having kids. And then after 5 years, I said, I got to make a change. So I moved from that to the telecommunications industry. Was able to stay in Northern Virginia, got a great job with a great company it was Sprint International at the time that I got the job. And a couple of years later, we ended up having our first son, which was a good so that was it was mostly international telecommunications. It was travel, but this time it was not dangerous travel. It was business travel, right? I remember going to Venezuela one time, and when I was at Sprint, and getting off at the airport in Caracas and seeing someone that I had worked with a couple of years before in a different capacity, and we just kind of looked at each other, nodded, and kept walking. So it was an interesting scenario that we had there. So I went from Sprint International. Sprint International became part of a global joint venture called Global One between Sprint International, France Telecom, and Deutsche Telekom. I rose through the ranks there. I started off in program management, moved into sales, and then it took the French, Germans, and Americans about 3 years to realize that they couldn't get along, so they dissolved the joint venture. And then France Telecom asked me to join sort of mothership France Telecom and run sales and marketing for them in Latin America, but also helping them launch operations in the United States. Because the United States for France Telecom had been Sprint, right? So I had to develop the entire sales and marketing strategy and plan for the United States, in addition to continuing to run Latin America for it. So, and then I took on responsibility for marketing in Canada as well. So, a couple of years into that, I was the head of sales and marketing for France Telecom for the entire Western Hemisphere. But I always kept sort of my military training and ethos with me. I remember one time my boss, the president of France Telecom USA, she was panicking because we didn't have a report ready in time, and I had to put my hand on her shoulder and I'd say, "Janet, remember, nobody's going to die over this."
Yeah.
Calm down. We got the report done, and everything was fine. But it was that type of mentality that I was able to bring to everything that I was able to do in my civilian career field. Putting things in perspective in their proper context.
I'd love to go back to Craig said you were chasing some cartels. But I would be curious about what from your kind of military background transferred to that particular experience.
So in that regard, aside from just the technical capacity of doing the job, the ability to interface with other groups and organizations was really critical. Working with, government entities in these different countries. And also the mission focus, so we had to work with folks that were not just, there were U.S. resources and there were foreign resources, and we'd have to find a way to be able to work together, focus on the mission, get the job done, and try to make sure that everybody got home safely, right? The one thing that I did learn during that time also was when every once in a while we'd have to interface with different U.S. government agencies, including the DEA, and the DEA were kind of reckless. They would come in and, the new sheriff in town, that kind of attitude, and we'd just stay away from them because they didn't get the concept of keeping a low profile and being discreet and so forth. So we those of us that came from the military knew that that was not the right approach for us to not just get the mission done, but also to come home.
I know one of the things that we talked a lot about when we met on the phone was just kind of all the bridges you built for kind of Latino veterans and just associations at large around that community. So could you tell us a little bit about kind of what gets you excited, what stories you think still might need to be told, and just kind of maybe zoom out a little bit, but then also get into maybe some specific things that you're working on?
I'll take one step back before I get into that, because when I was the head of sales and marketing for Trans Telecom for the Western Hemisphere, super important job. I was on a fast track for the corporate executive route in a major multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation. But I was on the road 70% of the time. And I was traveling internationally. I had people working for me in Europe, all throughout the United States, all in Latin America, and so forth. Fascinating job. But my son at the time, my firstborn, was 5 years old. So I wasn't watching him grow up. So I had to make a decision. I had to make a choice: either continue that path on the corporate executive route or be a dad. I couldn't do both. Right. So at that point in 2004, I decided to leave France Telecom and start my own business. I started my own business, Barcom Solutions. This is a marketing and public relations company, to have more latitude and flexibility to do what I needed to do for my family, with my family, and then, from a professional standpoint. With that latitude, I also got more involved in the community. So I became the chairman of our Chamber of Commerce in our neck of the woods in the Dulles area. I got involved in politics. I got more involved in the Hispanic community because there was a lot going on in Northern Virginia with regard to day laborers and gangs and all kinds of stuff, immigration and whatnot, right? So by virtue of the fact that I spoke the language, I was already involved in the community, that I had some leadership qualities and so forth, I kept getting pulled into some of these discussions and activities. Subsequent to that, I had learned about an effort to create a National American Latino Museum within the Smithsonian Institution. My member of Congress at the time, Frank Wolf, I went up to him. We had a good relationship because I had done some work for him. And I asked him, look, there's a bill being circulated to create a commission to study the feasibility of creating this museum. If it passes, I'd like you to, advance my name as being appointed to that commission. Well, sure enough, the bill passed in 2008. I was appointed by the Speaker of the House to that commission, along with 22 other people, including people like Yvonne Longoria and Emilio Estefan, and fascinating set of activities. We didn't come together as a commission for the first time until September of 2009, but we were traveling all over the country, getting input from citizens and experts in the field to be able to determine, the feasibility of creating this museum. One of the things that I would always talk about on these trips was the fact that Hispanics have been, vital to our national defense and our military from the Revolutionary War to today. And I would tell examples and stories about this. And most people just weren't aware of these historical facts. Everybody knows about Lafayette and the French during the Revolutionary War. Very few people knew about Ronaldo de Galvez and the over 11,000 Spanish troops and the millions of dollars equivalent, right, that Spain had provided the rebels in the United States to be able, and General Washington to be able to, wage their war of independence. So, all of these stories from the Revolutionary War to today, it just became apparent that there was a lack of knowledge and awareness. That, and the fact that as a veteran myself, I didn't feel that there were that many good national nonprofits focused on that intersectional population of, excuse me, my phone's ringing. My younger son. So I knew that there wasn't good
at the intersection. You didn't think that there was a lot of
good nonprofits focused on that intersectional population. After we delivered our report to Congress and the president in May of 2011, for the museum commission. There was a 501c3 Friends of the National American Antonio Museum, and I was asked to join the board of that. And there was an effort to authorize the Smithsonian to move forward, because to create a Smithsonian museum, we literally needed an act of Congress. So after the commission report in 2011, that same fall, it was the introduction of the first authorization bill for the museum. Trying to get co-sponsors for the bill wasn't very successful. It took a couple of iterations. I came in as chairman of that 501c3 Friends group in December of 2016, sort of revamped the messaging, revamped the approach and the strategy and so forth. And we're able to, in 2020, in July, we had garnered 295 co-sponsors for the House bill, which was more than 2/3 of the House.
Yeah.
And in July, it went up for a unanimous consent vote in the House, and it passed unanimously.
Great.
It then went on to the Senate, so our focus shifted to the Senate. And we worked to get co-sponsors for the bill. We had over half of the Senate co-sponsoring the bill, and it was up for unanimous consent vote in November in the Senate, and it was killed by one senator.
What? Who?
The senator from Utah. What's his name? Senator Lee, Mike Lee of Utah.
Oh yeah.
And we don't need any more of these, ethno museums. We can just add a wing to the American History Museum, even though we already had the American Indian Museum and the African American Museum. So we had to shift to Plan B, which was to get included in a must-pass omnibus bill. I had already testified to the Senate Rules Committee earlier in November or October of that year. So through a lot of effort and negotiation, we were able to get that our bill included in the omnibus bill, and that bill passed in December 21st of 2020, my birthday, and it was signed 6 days later by the president. So
wow.
that's how we were able to get that done.
You might be the only person in America that got something done during COVID.
Exactly. That's right.
Something big done.
Something big. And it was that year also that I said, you know what, the gap that I had identified in terms of there being a lack of nonprofits focused on Hispanic veterans, or a couple, right? There's American GI Forum, that's more of a club, chapters and all that stuff. So there's limitations with that. There's HVLA, which is focused on flag officers, generals and admirals, and getting more Hispanics there. And there's one called ANSO, which is focused on Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. But there wasn't one that was sort of broad-based across all branches that would include everyone. So I created it. So I created the American Latino Veterans Association in 2020. I didn't launch it officially until January of 2022, because I wanted to make sure we had the infrastructure in place and the website and some corporate funding and so forth. So I was able to launch it in January of 2022, and it's going super well so far. So I still keep my business going on, my day job, but I've also got that going on as a nonprofit, passion project as well. And I continue to stay involved in the community in a lot of different ways. I was the chairman of the Virginia Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We just recently issued our report on police oversight and accountability in Virginia. I'm the chairman of a economic development initiative called Go Virginia for Northern Virginia. I had been, a few years prior, I had been appointed by the governor, chairman of the state workforce board for the whole Commonwealth of Virginia. So we instituted important changes about how we are able to use a workforce system to get people trained and certified and credentialed to be able to fill the open jobs. So I've always found a way to be able to stay involved in the community, both with a foot both in the mainstream community as well as the Hispanic community, and serving on other nonprofit boards and other government commissions and so forth. So part of it is to make sure that I'm having an impact on the community, but also part of it is to be able to provide my kids with an example of how important it is to stay involved in the community. The one thing I failed to mention, though, so I told you my older son was 5 years old in 2004 when I started the company. My younger son came along. My younger son came along a year later in 2005. Yeah. So my oldest son is now almost 25, and my younger son is now 18.
Are either one of them involved in the military at all?
No, my oldest son thought about it for a little bit. He thought about joining the Air Force and going to the Air Force Academy. But that didn't pan out. So yeah, they always respect my service.
Absolutely. And maybe we could just talk a little. Do you mind if we just double click maybe about kind of like thinking about kind of maybe near term priorities kind of for your association? Sounds like you're raising awareness, but are there any goals that you particularly have, either for your members or for people currently in the service?
Yeah, so it's a membership organization. So it's free to all veterans and active duty folks and their immediate family members, because I think military service is not an individual exercise. It really is a family approach. You always need that support element to be able to get you through. So the 5 pillars of focus and activities for ALVA are around workforce development and job placement. So we've got MOUs in place, or memorandums of understanding with Park University, which has a significant military and veteran education program, Marymount University. A lot of the corporations that we're working with have pipelines to get people into the job funnel. So that's important to be able to get information out to veterans, especially if they're looking to either transition from active duty to the civilian workforce, or those that are looking to change career fields, right? So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is on entrepreneurship, because in many cases, the best way to achieve sustainable self-sufficiency is to start your own company. So we've got resources on information, how to start your company, how to grow your company, how to do government contracting, and we'll probably be doing franchising as an option as well. The third pillar is around telling those stories of, Latino military contributions from the Revolutionary War to today. We've done that so far through write-ups and podcasts and so forth, but we're going to be working on a series of short videos talking about everything from General Galvez to the first full admiral of the United States Navy, which was during the Civil War, David Farragut. There is a metro station in D.C. named after him. He was the guy that said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." He was Hispanic. His biological father was Jorge Farragut, who was one of the soldiers that fought with General Galvez with the rebels in the United States War of Independence. So a lot of people don't know that. During the World War II, there were 500,000 Hispanic troops that fought in every theater of World War II. During the Korean conflict, the 65th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army, the Buccaneers of Puerto Rico, which was, the last sort of segregated all Hispanic unit, was one of the most highly decorated combat units during the Korean conflict. To those, the 60 plus, Hispanic Medal of Honor recipients, so a lot of this information just isn't public knowledge, if you will. So part of it is telling those stories. The fourth pillar of activities around, just trying to coalesce and all the information on resources and benefits. There's so much information out there. It's almost too much information because it gets confusing for veterans, and particularly veterans who aren't already embedded in the VA system. Right? The VA does an okay job of communicating with folks that are already part of the system. Those that aren't, they may not be aware of the benefits that they have access to. So that's the fourth pillar. And then the last pillar is around advocacy, having a voice as it relates to public policy that affects the Hispanic community and the veteran population. We just had a gathering earlier this week with Minority Leader Jeffries in the House with about 35 or so veteran serving organizations, including ours. So having a voice in public policy is also important. So we hope to focus on those areas, but also we'll have events. We had our big event last year in DC in November. We had panels on entrepreneurship. We had an awards reception where we gave out, 5 awards to really deserving individuals. This year we'll do it again in DC, but and this year we'll probably do panels on careers in telecom and finance. But we also want to take the show on the road. We want to be able to go to Texas, and New York, and eventually Florida and California and New Mexico and Puerto Rico and other places, to be able to get that information out to folks where they are. And one of the public policy things that we spoke about during the meeting with Leader Jeffries was, the real need to be able to communicate better with that particular population. From a cultural competence perspective, if nothing else, if not language is also an issue, but cultural competence, there are better ways to be able to take advantage of the nuances within the community to be able to communicate with them more effectively. There are different communications channels that are more used. Social media, for example, they use radio more than the mainstream population. In many cases, it's better to get information to a veteran through a family member, through their mom or their wife or their kids, because the veteran themselves won't want to get that information. So some of those things are things that we're urging. So we hope to be able to continue to grow the membership, but also raise awareness. That's what we'll focus on. We've got great members of our board and advisory council. We've got, for example, Angela Salinas, who's Marine Corps, retired Marine Corps 2-star general. She's all about maybe 5 foot nothing, but probably one of the most powerful speakers I've heard in a long time. Olga Custodio, who was the first Latina fighter pilot in the Air Force. We've got John Leguizamo, who's the actor comedian, but also a strong advocate for telling these stories. Former Attorney General Alberto Gonzalez is our advisory council. So, we've got a robust offering of not just content, but also advocates that are pulling for us.
It sounds like there's a ton of momentum.
Yeah, there is. We've got great corporate support as well. I mean, JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo and T-Mobile and Verizon, AT&T and Accenture and others and PMI have stepped up to support us. So, I think we're on the right track. We've also partnered with the other organizations that I mentioned, American GI Forum, ANSO, and HVLA, because I think the best way for us to make a difference is to collaborate and work together. I think that's the model that I followed in some of the other activities that I've been involved in, whether it's economic development or the museum thing or workforce, finding ways to be able to capture the magic that is the public-private, nonprofit academic partnerships, right? Getting folks at the table that cover those 4 corners really is sort of the secret sauce of getting things done in a sustainable way.
All right. Well, I think that's the rest of our questions. We really appreciate your service and your time. If there's anything else you'd like to add, feel free, but that's all we had. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I'd want to add. I think in general, I really appreciate what you all are doing and what the Library of Congress is doing. I think the stories of military service and sacrifice are important, but it's also important to be able to show that these are real people.
Yeah.
Real people that come from real families, and in many cases they volunteer to put their lives on the line in their careers. I think there's a balance of being able to do the sacrifice, but also what you get out of it is so enriching and rewarding as well. So I think, hire a veteran, hug a veteran, thank a veteran. It's from my motto.
Love that. Well, thanks, Danny. This was amazing. Yeah, thanks for everything you continue to do. We haven't had a chance to meet with somebody who's kind of building an organization at scale. In DC, the way how you're coordinating so many people. So it's really impressive. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Honestly, as a kid who grew up in the streets of Brooklyn, all of this is sort of just an incredible blessing. Statistically, I should be dead or in jail right now. And so every day is just an honor, a blessing to be able to do what I do. So thank you.